If you can afford this dining set, I will quit before sunset. That was the first thing he said loud enough for the showroom to hear. Not welcome. Not how may I help you. Not what kind of space are you designing. Just that sentence. Smooth. Polished. Practiced. The kind of sentence a man says when he believes the room already belongs to him. The laughter came in pieces at first. One soft laugh near the marble reception desk. One sharper laugh from a couple standing beside a chandelier display. Then a wider ripple moved through the luxury furniture gallery as if humiliation had become part of the customer experience. I stood beside the walnut dining table with my hand resting lightly on the beveled edge. The wood was beautiful, dark, dense, finished with the kind of patience my father would have respected. I remember thinking that first. Not that the manager had insulted me. Not that strangers were watching. Not that a room full of people had suddenly agreed without speaking that I was a joke. I remember thinking the grain was honest. Wood usually is. People are harder. The price tag sat on a small brass stand near the head chair. $78,000. Not the most expensive thing I had seen that week. Not even close. But the manager watched me like the number itself was a locked gate, and he was the guard chosen to decide who deserved to pass. His nameplate said Brandon Cole, showroom director. He wore a charcoal suit and a white pocket square and shoes polished so clean they reflected the ceiling lights. Everything about him had been arranged to suggest taste, authority, access. The strange part was how little of it reached his eyes. His eyes were busy measuring me. Navy blouse, plain black slacks, comfortable shoes. No jewelry except my wedding band. No designer bag. No driver waiting visibly at the curb. No assistant holding a tablet beside me. Just a black woman standing alone inside a building where money was supposed to announce itself before it entered. He smiled after the laughter faded. I am serious. That table costs more than some cars. A woman near the window smiled into her phone. A man in a pale linen jacket looked me over and gave a small breath through his nose. One of the younger associates lowered her eyes. Not from amusement, from discomfort. I noticed her immediately because discomfort has a sound when people try to hide it. A shift of weight, a swallowed breath, a hand tightening around a folder. Her name tag said Emily. I turned back to the table and traced the edge with one finger. My father used to run his thumb along the underside of repaired chairs before he let customers pick them up. He said the underside told the truth because nobody decorated what they thought no one would see. That lesson had followed me from his workshop in Savannah to federal conference rooms in Washington to corporate boardrooms where men in expensive suits lied with impressive vocabulary. The underside always told the truth. I looked at Brandon and said it is well made. That seemed to disappoint him. He wanted heat. He wanted embarrassment. He wanted me to defend myself in a way that would make him feel proven. Instead, I gave him a fact. His smile grew sharper. Of course it is. Serious buyers come here for pieces like this. Serious buyers. There it was. Not a policy. Not a question. A classification. A velvet rope made out of words. I could have told him then. I could have taken the leather credential case from my bag and opened it beneath the showroom lights. I could have said that I was not there to buy a dining table for my house. I could have said that my office had received 3 complaints in 9 months about discriminatory sales practices at premium home retailers tied to federal development contracts. I could have said that his company had applied to furnish federally subsidized hospitality and senior housing projects through a procurement partnership worth more than he could imagine. I could have said that my name was Dr. Ava Richardson, Senior Compliance Auditor with the Office of Federal Contract Integrity. I could have said that every word he spoke after my arrival mattered. But there are moments when revealing the truth too early becomes mercy. And I was not there to grant mercy. I was there to observe. So I only looked at him, calmly, long enough for his smile to twitch. Then I asked whether I could see the rest of the collection. Can you imagine the weight of that silence when someone expects you to shrink and you simply ask to continue? Brandon blinked once. The room did not know what to do with my calm. That is the part people misunderstand about cruelty. It feeds on reaction. It needs anger to make itself look reasonable. It needs tears to make itself feel powerful. It needs departure to make itself feel victorious. But quiet compliance does something cruelty hates. It leaves the cruelty standing naked in the room. Emily stepped forward before Brandon could answer. Absolutely. I can walk you through our private collection. Her voice was steady but careful. Brandon glanced at her, a warning hidden inside a manager look. She saw it and kept moving anyway. I followed her across the showroom floor. The gallery stretched under high glass walls and suspended crystal fixtures that dropped warm light over staged rooms. Living rooms with white boucle chairs. Executive offices with carved desks. Bedroom suites behind translucent curtains. Dining sets arranged beneath chandeliers like altars to money. The air smelled of leather polish and fresh flowers, and something artificial that wanted to be called elegance. Emily began explaining the collections. She did not rush. She did not talk down to me. She answered directly when I asked about joinery. She paused when I asked about supplier certification. She looked surprised when I asked whether the walnut was sourced through documented chain of custody rather than decorative import claims. That question slowed her. I am not sure, but I can check the supplier documents. Please do. Brandon followed several steps behind us. He pretended to adjust displays. He pretended to greet customers. But each time I asked another question, I could feel his attention sharpen. His showroom had taught him that wealth usually performed itself. People came in wanting to be recognized. They named designers, mentioned neighborhoods, lifted wrists with watches heavy enough to speak. I gave him none of that. That made him reckless. We stopped beside a long table surrounded by 12 saddle leather chairs. Emily explained that only 3 existed in the country. I asked about delivery capacity. She said limited but possible. I asked whether the manufacturer could scale production for multi-site installations. She looked at me more carefully. Multi-site. Yes. Hospitality. Residential common areas. Executive dining rooms. Brandon arrived before she could answer. Most clients working at that scale already have procurement teams. His tone was smooth. Public. Protected by plausible professionalism. I nodded. That makes sense. He leaned one hand on the back of a chair. Individual shoppers rarely need that information. A few customers turned their heads. He was not shouting. That would have been too easy. He was doing what people like him do when they understand institutional language just well enough to weaponize it. He was hiding contempt inside process. He was making prejudice sound like efficiency. I looked down at the stitching on the chair back. Straight. Even. Better than his performance. Emily said softly that she could request the production information. Brandon cut in. We only prepare those packets for verified clients. There it was again. Verified. Another velvet rope. Another word designed to look neutral until placed in the right hands. I asked what verification required. Brandon smiled as if I had stepped exactly where he wanted. Proof of funding. Designer affiliation. Corporate authorization. Appointment history. Sometimes a deposit authorization, depending on the scale of the request. He said this while looking at my shoes. Not my face. My shoes. I looked at him until he was forced to lift his eyes. Then I said, I understand. Would you like me to provide any of that now? He seemed surprised, then amused. If you have it. The laughter came again. Smaller this time. Less confident. Because some people in the showroom had begun to hear the shape of what was happening. Emily looked at me with concern. I knew that look. It was the look decent people wear when they want to interrupt unfairness, but still have rent to pay. I opened my bag slowly. Brandon watched with lazy interest. I removed a plain black folder. Inside were several documents. None of them my federal credential. Not yet. I handed him a printed project summary with sensitive sections redacted. It listed a procurement review category, a regional lodging modernization initiative, a projected furnishings volume. It did not list my role. It did not need to. Brandon took the paper between 2 fingers as if it might stain him. His eyes moved over the page. For 1 second I saw a recognition flicker. Not of me. Of numbers. Large ones. Then his face rearranged itself into skepticism. Anyone can print a proposal summary. I nodded. That is true. He handed it back. We have had people come in with fake project documents before. I am sure you understand. I did understand. Perfectly. He was building a record for himself. A story he could tell later. I was protecting inventory. I was following policy. I was preventing fraud. But policies do not appear from nowhere. Someone chooses when to invoke them. Someone chooses whom to burden with proof. Someone chooses whether suspicion enters the room before respect. What would you have done in that moment? Would you have opened the badge case and ended it? Would you have walked out? Or would you have let the room keep speaking until every hidden thing became visible? I placed the paper back into my folder. Emily said there is a conference area where we can sit and review options. Brandon turned to her. Not necessary. His voice was still low but sharper now. I will handle this. Emily froze. His authority settled over her shoulders like a hand. He turned back to me. I am happy to show you pieces that fit a more realistic budget. The woman near the window stopped smiling. The couple beside the chandelier went silent. Somewhere behind us a pin clicked shut. I heard it because silence makes small things loud. I asked what budget he believed was realistic for me. Brandon lifted his brows. I would not want to assume. That was almost funny. The entire afternoon had been nothing but assumption dressed in a suit. I said, but you already have. The words were quiet. No accusation. Just a mirror. His jaw tightened. Ma'am, this is a luxury showroom. We protect our staff from time-wasting appointments. We protect our vendors from unserious inquiries. We protect our clients from disruption. There it was. Protect. Another good word placed in bad hands. He had now turned my presence into a threat. Not because I raised my voice. Not because I touched anything I should not. Not because I violated any posted rule. Because I asked questions above the station he assigned me. I looked around the showroom. The marble. The glass. The soft gold light. The customers pretending to browse while listening. The associates suddenly busy with nothing. Then I looked back at him. I have not disrupted anyone. Brandon smiled with the patience of a man performing reasonableness for witnesses. You may not realize how this environment works. Certain inquiries require a level of qualification. We cannot open internal pricing structures to every walk-in visitor. I said, then please provide your written qualification policy. That changed the air. Only slightly. But enough. Emily looked up. Brandon looked at me. I kept my face neutral. He said, excuse me? I said, if pricing access is restricted by written policy, then I would like to review the policy. His smile thinned. Our policies are internal. Then how would a visitor know what standard applies? He did not answer quickly enough. It was the first clean break in his rhythm. I waited. Calmly. He glanced toward the reception desk, then toward the office corridor behind the showroom. Then back at me. We reserve management discretion. Management discretion. Of course. The most dangerous phrase in any service environment because it can mean judgment based on conduct or judgment based on bias, depending on who holds it. I nodded. Please document that discretion was applied to me today. Now the room was fully listening. Not openly, not dramatically, but everyone had shifted into the posture of attention. Brandon saw it. A man like that knows when a room is with him and when it has become uncertain. He responded the way insecure authority often responds when uncertainty arrives. He escalated. I think it would be best if we pause this visit. Emily inhaled. I heard it. Brandon continued. You are welcome to return with a verified designer or proof of purchasing authority. Until then, our team will not be able to continue dedicating staff resources to this inquiry. Staff resources. Emily had spent perhaps 12 minutes with me. Brandon had spent more time insulting me than she had spent assisting me. I asked whether he was refusing service. No. He said it too fast. We are setting reasonable conditions. Based on what conduct? Based on the nature of your request. The nature of my request was to see furniture. His ears reddened. The man in the linen jacket lowered his gaze. The young associate at reception stared at her screen without typing. Brandon stepped closer. Not too close. Just close enough to remind me that he controlled the floor. Ma'am, I am going to ask you not to create a scene. I almost smiled. A scene. The word arrived before the event. That is another tactic. Name the behavior before it exists. Accuse someone of becoming disruptive while they are still calm. Create the threat you need in order to justify the force you want. I said I am standing still. You are raising administrative barriers that do not appear to be posted. I am asking for the policy behind them. He looked toward the ceiling as if praying for patience. I am not going to debate store operations with you. Then please call whoever can. His face hardened. I am the showroom director. Then please direct the showroom according to written standards. For a moment, he had no answer. And in that small empty space, I saw exactly who he was. Not a monster. Monsters are too simple. Brandon was something more common and more dangerous. A man who had been rewarded for confusing taste with worth. A man who had learned that exclusion could be profitable if wrapped in luxury language. A man who believed politeness belonged to people who looked expensive enough to deserve it. He turned away from me and spoke to Emily without looking at her. Return to your station. Emily hesitated. I am assisting. Return to your station. The second time was colder. She moved back slowly. Shame crossed her face, although she had done nothing wrong. I wanted to tell her that. I wanted to say that his command said everything about him and nothing about her. But I was not there to comfort the witnesses yet. I was there to let the record form. Brandon faced me again. I need you to leave for now. The sentence landed softly because he wanted it to sound procedural. I asked if I was being trespassed. He blinked. No one had expected that word. Are you refusing to leave? I am asking whether you are issuing a trespass notice. His mouth tightened. If necessary. Please be specific. The woman near the window lowered her phone completely. The room had stopped pretending. Brandon looked around and saw too many eyes. So he smiled again. That showroom smile. That expensive empty smile. We are simply ending an unproductive interaction. You are welcome to come back when you are prepared to shop appropriately. Shop appropriately. I repeated it in my mind. Not aloud. Some phrases need to remain untouched so they can condemn themselves. Then I said, please provide your name and title. He tapped the nameplate with one finger. Brandon Cole, showroom director. I said thank you. He laughed once. Tight. Are you writing a complaint? I looked at him. I am making a record. His expression changed. Not fear yet. Irritation first. Then calculation. He glanced at my folder. Maybe he wondered whether I was recording. Maybe he wondered whether I was a lawyer. Maybe for the first time that afternoon, he wondered whether plain clothes could still contain consequence. He made a choice then. A choice I had seen made in airports, hospitals, banks, schools, government buildings. A person with limited authority feels that authority slipping and reaches for someone with a uniform. Brandon turned toward the reception desk. Please contact building security. The words were quiet, but they struck the room harder than shouting would have. Emily looked stricken. A customer whispered something to her husband. The receptionist picked up the phone slowly. Brandon kept his eyes on me. This is standard protocol when a guest refuses management direction. Guest refuses direction. He was writing the incident out loud. I said I have not refused. You asked me to leave. I asked whether you were issuing a trespass notice. He said you were being difficult. There it was. Not disruptive. Not unsafe. Difficult. The accusation used when obedience is expected but questions arrive instead. I nodded once. I will wait for security. The calmness bothered him more than resistance would have. I could see it. He wanted me to protest so he could point to my tone. He wanted me to move toward him so he could step back and call it aggression. He wanted me to raise my voice so he could lower his and win the room. I gave him none of it. I walked to the side of the showroom near a console table and stood with both hands visible around my folder. Visible hands matter when people are trying to turn you into a threat. My mother taught me that before I was old enough to understand why. Keep your hands where they can see them. Keep your voice level. Keep your sentences short. Do not give fear extra material. I hated that she had to teach me that. I hated that I still used it. Brandon stood several feet away and watched me like a problem being contained. Security arrived within minutes. 2 men in navy jackets. One older, one younger. The older guard looked at me first and then at Brandon. His face had the weary caution of someone who had walked into too many situations created by ego. Brandon spoke before anyone asked. This visitor has been asked to leave after making inappropriate demands of staff and refusing to comply. Inappropriate demands. I looked at the guard. I asked to see written qualification policies after being denied pricing access. Brandon exhaled sharply. That is not accurate. The guard looked between us. He asked whether I would be willing to step into the lobby to discuss it. I said yes. Brandon seemed annoyed that I agreed. People like him often mistake compliance for weakness until they discover it can be evidence. I walked toward the lobby with security beside me. The showroom parted quietly. Not physically. Emotionally. Customers looked away as I passed. Some with embarrassment. Some with curiosity. Some with the relief of people glad it was not happening to them. Emily stood near the reception desk with tears shining in her eyes. I gave her the smallest nod. Not enough to draw Brandon attention. Enough to tell her I had seen her. In the lobby, the glass doors reflected the Atlanta skyline behind me. Late afternoon light spilled across the floor. The older guard introduced himself as Mr. Harris. His voice was respectful. He asked what happened. I explained in plain language. I did not add emotion. I did not interpret motive. I stated actions. Initial mockery. Repeated references to serious buyers. Refusal to provide volume pricing. Unposted verification requirements. Denial of written policy. Instruction to leave. Security call. Brandon interrupted twice. Mr. Harris raised one hand the second time. Let her finish. That small sentence changed the pressure in Brandon's face. I finished. Then Brandon gave his version. It was polished. Concern for staff. Suspicious documents. Unreasonable procurement questions. Refusal to accept management judgment. Potential disruption to high-value clients. He spoke like a man who had translated bias into liability language many times before. Mr. Harris listened. The younger guard stood near the entrance and said nothing. When Brandon finished, Mr. Harris asked whether there was a written policy requiring proof of purchasing authority before pricing discussion. Brandon said internal discretion applies. Mr. Harris asked whether I had been loud or threatening. Brandon paused, then said she was argumentative. Mr. Harris asked again, loud or threatening? Brandon looked at me, then away. Not loud, but she was challenging my authority. Challenging my authority. The phrase floated between us like an admission wearing the wrong clothes. I looked through the glass toward the showroom. Employees were watching from a distance. Customers too. The scene he tried to create had become something else. Not a removal, an examination. And still he did not know who was doing the examining. A black sedan pulled to the curb outside. I saw it before Brandon did. Then a second vehicle. Government plates are not dramatic to most people. They do not flash. They do not announce themselves. They simply arrive. The rear door opened and Marcus Vale stepped out first. Senior counsel assigned to my review team. Behind him came Dana Whitfield from Procurement Integrity. Brandon followed my gaze. His eyes narrowed at the vehicles, then at the two professionals walking toward the entrance with leather portfolios and federal identification clipped discreetly at their belts. For the first time that afternoon, he stopped performing. The glass doors opened. Cool air moved into the lobby. Marcus saw me, and his expression tightened in the precise way lawyers tighten when they realize the situation has already become worse than anticipated. Dr. Richardson. He said it clearly, respectfully. The title crossed the lobby and entered the showroom behind us. Brandon went still. Not frightened yet. Not fully. But something inside his certainty cracked. Mr. Harris looked at me, then at Marcus, then at Brandon. Dana stepped beside Marcus and opened her portfolio. The gold seal on the top document caught the light. Brandon stared at it. I did not move. I did not smile. I did not reach for my badge yet. Not because I was hiding anymore. Because the room needed one more second to understand that the woman they had watched being treated as a nuisance had not been trying to enter power. She had been carrying it the entire time. She had been carrying it the entire time. Marcus stopped less than an arm's length from me and offered the smallest nod. We had worked together long enough to communicate entire conversations without speaking. His eyes asked one question. Had I revealed anything? Mine answered just as quietly. Not yet. Dana stood beside him, holding a sealed portfolio marked with the procurement review identifier that only participating agencies would recognize. She looked toward Brandon with professional neutrality. Not hostility. Not triumph. Simply observation. The kind that cannot be persuaded by charm after the fact. Mr. Harris looked between all of us before clearing his throat. Dr. Richardson, are these your colleagues? Marcus answered before I could. We are members of the Federal Contract Integrity Review assigned to this regional procurement evaluation. Brandon frowned as though the words had reached him in the wrong order. Federal. Procurement. Evaluation. Regional. Review. Each one landed separately before assembling into something far heavier than he expected. He forced a smile that appeared almost painful. I think there has been some misunderstanding. Marcus looked at him politely. We are here to determine whether that is true. Dana removed a thin folder and handed it to Mr. Harris instead of Brandon. The older security officer opened the first page. His posture changed almost immediately. He looked back toward me with quiet respect. Brandon noticed that change before he saw the document itself. People who depend on hierarchy become experts at reading body language. He knew authority had entered the room. He simply did not know how much. Customers had begun drifting toward the lobby entrance without pretending otherwise. No one wanted to interfere. Everyone wanted to understand. Emily stood several yards inside the showroom with both hands clasped together. She looked frightened for reasons that had nothing to do with herself. I hoped she understood that nothing happening now was because she had failed. If anything, she had become the only reason the afternoon still contained dignity. Brandon finally spoke again. Had we known you represented a federal review? I raised one hand gently. That sentence is important. He stopped. I continued in the same calm voice I had used since entering the building. Because the standard you provide to customers should not depend on whether you know they represent a federal office, or a corporation, or a school teacher, or a retired mechanic. Respect that appears only after credentials appear is not respect. It is risk management. No one answered. Even the air conditioning seemed louder inside the silence. Dana opened another document. As part of the procurement qualification process, our office conducts unannounced observational visits. We evaluate customer interaction, policy consistency, accessibility of purchasing procedures, documentation standards, and potential disparities in discretionary treatment. Brandon stared at her. Observational visits. Unannounced. He repeated the words slowly, as if hoping repetition might reduce their meaning. Marcus nodded. The purpose is to observe ordinary operations rather than prepared demonstrations. Brandon looked at me again. You never said who you were. I met his eyes. You never asked. Another silence followed. Longer this time. Can you imagine realizing that the question you never bothered to ask became the one answer that changed everything? Mr. Harris closed the folder carefully and handed it back to Dana. He looked uncomfortable, not because he feared consequences for himself, because he had unknowingly stepped into a situation manufactured by someone else's assumptions. Brandon drew a slow breath. I believe we can resolve this professionally. Marcus answered with remarkable calm. That is precisely what we intend to do. Professionally. Brandon tried again. If there were concerns about our procedures, we would be happy to review them internally. Dana shook her head. Internal review may become part of your corrective response. It cannot replace documented findings. The distinction mattered. Brandon understood that. I watched the certainty drain from his posture one careful inch at a time. Not panic. Not yet. Something quieter. The realization that authority was no longer flowing in the direction he expected. Emily finally stepped into the lobby after glancing toward another associate who gave her a small, encouraging nod. She stopped near the entrance. Brandon noticed her and immediately said, Emily, return to the floor, please. His voice carried the familiar instinct to regain control through routine. I spoke before she moved. She may remain if she chooses. Dana added, potential witnesses are not excluded from observational discussions unless confidentiality requires otherwise. Emily remained exactly where she was. Brandon looked as though he wanted to object, then decided against it. That choice alone revealed more than an argument would have. Marcus asked a simple question. Mr. Cole, could you explain the written policy requiring proof of purchasing authority before providing volume pricing information? Brandon answered carefully. We reserve management discretion depending on the seriousness of the inquiry. Marcus waited. I recognized the pause. He always allowed people enough silence to either strengthen their explanation or expose its weakness. Brandon continued. Certain requests indicate unrealistic purchasing scenarios. Dana asked, how is unrealistic defined? By documented criteria or individual judgment? Brandon hesitated. Mostly management experience. Dana wrote one sentence in her notebook. The sound of the pen moving across paper echoed far louder than it should have. Brandon watched the notebook instead of her face. That also mattered. People rarely fear memory. They fear documentation. Marcus asked another question. Had Dr. Richardson raised her voice? No. Threatened staff? No. Entered restricted areas? No. Damaged merchandise? No. Refused a lawful instruction after issuance of formal trespass notice? Brandon looked toward Mr. Harris before answering. We never issued a formal notice. Marcus nodded once. So the interaction escalated to security despite the absence of documented disruptive conduct. Brandon opened his mouth, closed it again, then said, she continued challenging management decisions. Dana looked up from her notes. Asking for written policy is not generally classified as disruptive conduct. Brandon rubbed one hand against the back of his neck. I could almost hear his internal calculations. Every sentence he had relied upon earlier sounded different now because the room evaluating them had changed. That happens often inside institutions. The facts remain exactly the same. Only the audience changes. I thought about my father again. He never spoke about prejudice with dramatic speeches. He spoke about measurements. He used to hold two pieces of wood beside each other and ask whether the ruler changed depending on who held it. The answer was always no. The measurement stayed the same. Only people pretended otherwise. That memory settled quietly beside me while Marcus continued. Mr. Cole, During the interaction, you referred more than once to serious buyers. Could you define that phrase? Brandon looked genuinely uncomfortable now. I simply meant qualified purchasers. Qualified according to what published standard? Purchasing history, financial capacity, professional representation. Dana asked, was any of that requested from surrounding customers before assistance began? Brandon glanced toward the showroom. Nobody answered for him. Emily lowered her eyes. The couple who had laughed earlier now stood near the dining displays pretending to examine a catalog they had not turned in several minutes. Brandon finally admitted, not usually. Marcus asked, why not? Because they appeared. He stopped himself before completing the sentence. The unfinished words filled the lobby anyway. Appeared what? Wealthy, appropriate, familiar, believable. He never had to finish. Every person present completed the sentence privately. What would you have heard in that silence? A confession, or simply habit speaking before caution caught it? Dana wrote another note. Brandon looked almost physically pained by the movement of her pen. He finally faced me directly. Dr. Richardson, I owe you an apology. I listened without interruption. He continued, I allowed assumptions to influence my judgment. I should have treated you differently. I answered quietly, no, you should not have treated me differently. You should have treated everyone the way you now wish you had treated me. His shoulders dropped. The sentence reached him more deeply than any accusation could have. No one applauded. No dramatic reaction arrived. Truth rarely announces itself loudly. It simply removes every comfortable place left to stand. Marcus closed his portfolio. Our purpose today is not personal embarrassment. It is institutional reliability. Federal procurement depends on consistent public treatment, especially when discretionary authority is involved. Brandon nodded almost automatically. I understand. Do you? Marcus asked gently. Because understanding begins after the apology, not before it. Brandon did not answer immediately. I believed experience allowed me to recognize serious clients. He stopped and looked toward the showroom floor where sunlight stretched across the marble. Now I realize I was recognizing appearances instead. Dana closed her notebook. That distinction will appear in our findings. Mr. Harris quietly excused himself to return to his security responsibilities. Before leaving, he looked at me and said, I appreciate how calmly you handled this. I smiled. Thank you for listening before deciding. He nodded once. Listening first. That should not be remarkable. Yet too often it is. Emily gathered enough courage to step closer. Dr. Richardson, I am sorry for what happened. I shook my head gently. You treated me with professionalism from the moment we met. Do not apologize for conduct that was not yours. Relief crossed her face so quickly it almost hurt to watch. She had carried responsibility that never belonged to her. Brandon looked at Emily as though seeing her for the first time that day. He remembered the moments he interrupted her, corrected her, ordered her back to her station. Authority had blinded him not only to me, but also to the employee trying to protect the company's integrity before anyone else realized it was in danger. Marcus checked the time. We still have the scheduled operational review. Dana nodded. I would also like access to customer service documentation, training materials, escalation protocols, and discretionary sales guidelines. Brandon answered immediately. Of course. His voice no longer carried performance, only exhaustion. He led us back toward the showroom. Customers stepped aside quietly as we entered. The atmosphere felt completely different from the one I had walked into less than an hour earlier. Not because people suddenly respected me, because they had been forced to examine the standards by which they respected anyone. I paused beside the same walnut dining table where everything had begun, though it still looked honest. It had remained exactly the same while every human judgment around it shifted. I rested my fingertips lightly against its edge once more. My father would have appreciated that irony. Furniture had never judged the hands that touched it. Only people had done that. Marcus stopped beside me. Ready. I looked across the showroom where employees waited with uncertain expressions and Brandon stood quietly holding the conference room door open. I answered with the same calm certainty that had carried me through every moment since I entered the building. Yes. Now the real evaluation begins. Now the real evaluation begins. Brandon held the conference room door open without speaking. Earlier that afternoon, he had used the doorway like a gate. Now it had become an invitation. The difference was subtle, yet everyone inside the showroom understood it. Authority had not disappeared. It had simply changed its purpose. We entered a spacious glass conference room overlooking the showroom floor. Samples of wood finishes covered one wall. Fabric books rested in perfect rows across floating shelves. Architectural renderings of luxury dining spaces framed the far side of the room. Everything had been designed to impress clients before a single conversation began. Marcus placed his portfolio on the table. Dana connected a secure tablet to begin the documentation process. Brandon remained standing until Marcus quietly suggested he take a seat. That small gesture seemed to surprise him. He sat slowly. Emily lingered outside the room before I looked toward her. "Would you join us for the customer service portion?" She hesitated. Brandon answered before she could. "Yes, please do." His voice carried something it had lacked all afternoon. Respect without calculation. Emily entered carefully and sat near the end of the table. Dana opened the review by explaining the process. Today's observations would become part of a broader assessment covering consistency of treatment across multiple vendors competing for federal procurement opportunities. No single interaction automatically determined qualification. Patterns did. Documented behavior did. Leadership responses did. Corrective action did. Brandon listened with complete attention. Gone was the polished confidence that assumed every answer before the question finished. In its place sat a man finally willing to hear questions he had avoided asking himself. Marcus began with policy manuals. Brandon provided digital copies. Dana compared written procedures against the interaction we had just experienced. Several sections aligned perfectly with industry standards. Greeting expectations. Accessibility requirements. Complaint resolution. Equal service language. Then she reached the discretionary sales section. She looked up. This section authorizes managers to determine whether extensive procurement support should be provided. Brandon nodded. Correct. Dana continued. It does not authorize assumptions based on appearance. Brandon answered quietly. No, it does not. Marcus asked. Then why did that occur? Brandon stared at the table for several seconds before answering. Because somewhere over the years I stopped following the policy and started trusting my instincts. Marcus folded his hands. Instincts built from what? Brandon gave a tired smile. Patterns I believed I recognized. Expensive clothing. Luxury vehicles. Familiar names. Certain neighborhoods. Dana asked. Were those patterns ever validated against actual purchasing outcomes? Brandon blinked. No, I suppose they were not. Marcus nodded gently. That matters. Human intuition often mistakes familiarity for accuracy. We remember the wealthy customers who dressed expensively because they confirm our expectations. We forget the exceptions because they challenge them. Brandon looked thoughtful rather than defensive now. I never considered that. Emily finally spoke. I did. Everyone turned toward her. She swallowed before continuing. Some of our largest purchases over the past 2 years came from customers who arrived looking completely ordinary. Contractors, school administrators, restaurant owners, people furnishing homes after selling businesses. I stopped trying to guess years ago because I kept being wrong. Brandon looked at her with genuine surprise. Why didn't you ever tell me that? Emily smiled sadly. I did. A few times. You said experience mattered more than statistics. Silence settled over the room again. Brandon rubbed one hand across his forehead. I actually said that. Emily nodded once. Yes. Marcus looked toward Brandon. Experience is valuable. Unless it stops learning. Brandon gave a slow nod. I understand now. Dana asked another question. During today's interaction, why did you interpret requests for documentation as confrontation? Brandon answered almost immediately this time. Because I felt my authority being questioned. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Was it your authority? Or your certainty? Brandon looked directly at him. The distinction landed immediately. My certainty. Marcus smiled faintly. That is a much more useful answer. We spent the next hour reviewing employee training records, complaint logs, customer surveys, internal coaching notes. The company had far fewer complaints than many competitors. Most involved delayed deliveries or damaged shipments. Only a handful involved customer interaction. Yet the similarities were impossible to ignore. Several described feeling dismissed before meaningful conversations began. One mentioned assumptions about affordability. Another described being redirected toward lower-priced collections without requesting it. None proved deliberate discrimination by themselves. Together, they suggested a pattern worth examining. Brandon read each complaint more slowly than the last. I approved responses to all of these. He whispered, almost to himself. But I never noticed what connected them. Dana replied quietly. Patterns often become visible only after someone decides to look for them. Outside the conference room, customers continued moving through the showroom. Business had resumed. Conversations flowed again. Yet employees occasionally glanced toward the glass walls. They knew something important was happening inside. Not because federal officials were present. Because their workplace was examining itself honestly. That is rarer than audits. Marcus eventually closed the final complaint file. Based on today's observations, I believe this organization has an opportunity rather than merely a problem. Brandon looked up. Opportunity. Marcus nodded. Systems can be redesigned. Culture can be improved. Leadership can change. Those outcomes depend entirely on whether today's lesson becomes memory or practice. Brandon answered without hesitation. Practice. I want it to become practice. Dana closed her notebook. Then let us discuss corrective measures. They outlined recommendations. Mandatory leadership bias awareness focused on decision-making rather than accusation. Objective qualification procedures for procurement inquiries. Clear written explanations available to every visitor. Quarterly audits comparing discretionary decisions across customer groups. Anonymous employee reporting for inconsistent treatment. Brandon agreed to each recommendation before discussion even finished. Marcus stopped him. Do not agree because we are here. Agree because you believe they are necessary. Brandon looked toward Emily, then toward the showroom beyond the glass. Finally back at us. I believe they are necessary because I watched myself ignore my own written standards today. I cannot defend that anymore. Emily smiled for the first time since I had entered the building. It was a small smile. Quiet. Hopeful. The kind earned rather than performed. We concluded the formal review shortly before sunset. Marcus gathered the portfolios. Dana secured the documentation. Brandon walked us toward the showroom entrance. Customers barely noticed us now. The dramatic moment had already passed. What remained was quieter. More important, before reaching the doors, Brandon stopped beside the walnut dining table. The same table where everything had begun. He rested one hand on its polished surface. Earlier today, I believed this represented luxury. He said softly. I was wrong. I looked at him. What does it represent now? He smiled with visible humility. A reminder that every expensive object in this building becomes worthless the moment the people selling it forget the value of the people standing in front of them. I nodded once. My father would have agreed with that. Brandon looked curious. Your father built furniture, didn't he? He repaired it. I answered. He used to tell me that beautiful finishes hide weak construction for a while. But eventually, every hidden weakness reaches the surface. Brandon looked around the showroom. Today mine did. I said nothing. There was nothing left to add. Outside, the evening sky had turned deep orange across the Atlanta skyline. Marcus and Dana walked toward the waiting government vehicle. I thanked them both for arriving exactly when needed. Marcus smiled. We almost came in earlier. I shook my head. Then we would have learned less. He laughed quietly. True. Dana added. Patience is sometimes the most effective investigative tool. We left together. The showroom doors closed behind us. Through the glass, I saw Brandon remain standing where we had left him. Not watching us. Watching the entrance. Watching every new customer who stepped inside. Really seeing them. Weeks passed before the final procurement decision was announced. The showroom completed every corrective action ahead of schedule. Independent follow-up visits documented measurable improvements. Mystery shoppers reported consistent treatment regardless of appearance. Employees described a noticeable cultural shift. Emily was promoted to customer experience manager and helped redesign onboarding for every new hire. Brandon voluntarily requested executive coaching and personally led the first training session by describing his own mistakes without minimizing them. He never mentioned my name publicly. He did not need to. The lesson was never about me. It was about the danger of believing confidence can replace character. 3 months later, I returned quietly on another observational visit. No announcement. No government vehicle visible outside. The same navy blouse. The same comfortable shoes. A young couple entered moments before I did, wearing paint-stained jeans and work boots. Brandon greeted them first. Welcome. Take all the time you need. If you have questions about any collection, I would be happy to help. No assumptions. No shortcuts. No invisible barriers. Exactly the same greeting he offered me 30 seconds later. Emily caught my eye from across the showroom, but continued assisting another customer without interruption. She understood the assignment perfectly. Equal treatment means equal attention. Brandon approached after finishing with the couple. "Good afternoon, Dr. Richardson." "Good afternoon, Brandon." He smiled. No performance, only gratitude. We walked together toward the walnut dining table. It remained exactly where it had always been. Beautiful, honest, familiar. Brandon laughed softly. "We never sold this one." I looked at the wood grain beneath the afternoon light. Maybe it was waiting for the right purpose. He nodded. "I think it found one." We stood quietly for a moment while customers explored the showroom around us. No one recognized me. No one needed to. Justice does not always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrives as a standard that quietly changes how strangers are treated long after everyone forgets the original incident. Before leaving, I shook Brandon's hand. "Thank you for choosing improvement instead of excuses." He answered with complete sincerity. "Thank you for giving us the chance to become the company we thought we already were." I stepped through the glass doors into the warm Atlanta afternoon. Behind me, conversations continued. Employees welcomed new visitors. Questions were answered before judgments were formed. No headlines appeared. No viral videos circulated. No public spectacle followed. The change lived inside ordinary moments that would never make the news. A respectful greeting. An unanswered assumption. A policy applied consistently. A customer treated with dignity before anyone knew what they could buy. As I walked toward the waiting car, I thought once more about my father's workshop. He had been right all those years ago. Structure reveals character. The underside always tells the truth. And when people finally choose to strengthen the structure instead of polishing the surface, that quiet decision becomes the most lasting form of justice.